This is the University of Otago.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the launch of New Zealand Christians in Science in Dunedin. And my name is Nicola Hoggard Creegan, and I'm one of the co-directors of New Zealand Christians in Science. And we're very grateful tonight to Professor Gillett, who's offered to give a lecture on the soul to mark this occasion. I've been conducting lunchtime meetings, and probably about half of you have been to one of those. But if you haven't been to one of those, can you all take one of these before you leave, please? Thank you. And I should also say that there's going to be dinner at a cafe across the road. What's the name of the cafe? Eureka. Very appropriate name. So please do join us for dinner if you are able to do so afterwards. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to New Zealand Christians in Science, which is a new organisation, and then Murray will introduce Grant. So there's a website, New Zealand Christians in Science, which has an awful lot of explanation about who we are. It's got an explanation of who the people are involved. It's got resources like books to read if you're interested in starting your investigation or continuing your investigation in science and theology. And it's got an active blog. So do go there and find out what's going on, and also join. Students can join for free, and faculty join for $30, so that's not too expensive. If you're a theologian, you can join TANZA, which is Theology in the Natural Sciences in Aotearoa. And if you're a scientist, you join NZCIS, but really they're all the same thing, and they have the same web portal and the same events. And if you're just an interested member of the public, you can also join. There's an associate membership as well. So do go there and find out what's going on. The people involved, there's a young chemistry student called Jake Martin in Auckland, who was the one who actually wrote the grant with Dr. Graham Finlay from the Auckland Medical School. They wrote the grant to the Templeton World Charity Foundation last year. And it's very surprisingly to me, we actually got the grant. So there we go. And so Jake Martin, Graham Finlay, myself, and Zachary Arden are all board members. And we also have an advisory board, which includes Professor Gareth Jones, Professor Helen Nicholson, Professor Grant Gillett, and I think that's, and also Philip Pattermore from the Otago Medical School in Canterbury. Sorry, in Christchurch. Jake and Graham saw a need to have an organisation like this in New Zealand, similar to the ones in other countries like UK Christians in Science, ISCAST and Biologos. You have probably all been to those websites if you're interested, or experienced those events overseas. So they thought that it would be good to have that kind of organisation here, which would allow the same kinds of conversations to take place here. And I had run something called TANZA for about 7 years in Auckland, which was a theologically based theology and science group. And so we have deliberately combined those two together so that we do have theologians as well as scientists involved in the overall enterprise. Okay. One of the things I need to advertise is that on September 22nd and 23rd in Auckland, there will be our first conference, which is going to be called God of Wonder, Science Talks to Theology, and Professor Christopher Southgate will be our keynote speaker. He wrote The Groaning of Creation. He's done scientific work also on the origins of life, and he's written 6 volumes of poetry. So do come if you can to Auckland for that conference. There will be student scholarships, so get in touch with me if you want to come. Okay. Just to sort of give a little bit of an overview, there are, of course, many areas of importance. In the discussions I've had over the last few days, people immediately bring up ethics. And ethics, of course, is important, but we're also interested in all sorts of other areas that are important in the science-theology interface, like how do we understand human nature and its uniqueness? How do we understand the providence of God in a context where naturalism is assumed, as it often is in science? How did religion emerge and what is its relevance? How do we relate to other forms of other life forms, for instance. Human consciousness, what is it, and are we free? I know these are impossible questions, but they are all questions at this interface of science and theology. What is human sin in the context of evolutionary history? The problem of evil in the presence of God. I mean, the closer we think God is, the greater the problem of evil. And then what about robotics and artificial intelligence and the changing technological profile of everyday life? These are all issues that we expect will be covered in some way in the coming years. And I also wanted to end with a verse from Scripture. Much of Scripture, of course, justifies this endeavour, but especially I think Colossians 1, in Christ all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible. All things have been created through him and for him, and Christ is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So I think that is a sufficient justification for the kind of interdisciplinary work that we want to do. If you have any more questions, I'm going to be at dinner and I'll be here afterwards, so please do say hello to me and ask whatever questions you have, or you can email me. My email is on here as well. So now I'm going to hand over to Murray, who will talk about Grant. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes, Grant, I would like to publicly thank Nicola for coming down and spending these few days in Dunedin to encourage Otago's participation in this new initiative, New Zealand Christians in Science. We really appreciate, Nicola, your time and the enthusiasm you have for what Otago can contribute to this enterprise. So I'm glad to introduce tonight Professor Grant Gillett, who's Professor of Biomedical Ethics here in the Division of Health Sciences at Otago. And Grant really epitomises the kind of interdisciplinarity that New Zealand Christians in Science seeks to promote. Grant's expertise ranges across neuroscience, philosophy and bioethics, to name only those disciplines in which he has at various times held academic appointments. But his personal and his scholarly interests extend far beyond that, including notably on this occasion, the field of Christian theology. So Grant is eminently qualified, therefore, to present this lecture tonight, through which we seek to launch and promote the work of NZCIS here in the University of Otago. Grant's title, as you will have seen, is Aristotle and Neuroscience, the Human Soul. Please join me in welcoming Grant.
Is that on? Yep. Yep. Okay. Okay, so Aristotle as his pupil didn't quite buy the whole package. In fact, the way in which the human mind could grasp those perfect or heavenly forms seemed an almost intractable problem. Plato's answer for it was that we as humans had a divine part to us, and that divine part was able to connect with heavenly things, and therefore through that divine part, most exemplified in the human intellect, and most exemplified when it was reasoning properly, we were able to grasp those eternal, immutable, logically definable forms which told us, or which showed exactly what things were. So if I look around the room and I see human beings, I see they've all got different shapes. I see, in fact, with an educated eye, not that educated perhaps, that there's two different kinds of them. And these days, of course, we know there's 5 or 6 different kinds on that single dimension of sexuality and gender. So none of you can be taken as properly intellectually representative of all human beings. That is something I grasp quite alongside my acquaintance with various examples or instances of that, let's use a technical term, metaphysical species. So there is a kind of thing in the universe called a human being that is a distinct kind of a thing. If I were to take any one of you as a perfect exemplar of that, I would be making an error of some kind. I would think, for instance, that all humankind were women, or more commonly in history, I would think that all humankind were men. And women were just deficient versions of the species. And of course we know that it actually took us a couple of thousand years to sort of begin to get over that particular mistake. But Aristotle was not so sure that this appeal to a divine aspect and to heaven was at all easy to grasp or to have any proper knowledge of. So he began looking at things, as it were, from the other end. Perhaps an aspect of us that isn't just bound to causally reacting to things, derived from our acquaintance with things, something that wasn't just a matter of the material or causal impact on us. Perhaps we derive from our diverse acquaintances with things in the world a set of intellectual structures that in fact allow us to grasp things in a different way, in exactly the way that is exemplified by the move from any particular human being whom I happen to bump into, and the idea of human beings in general as a distinct metaphysical type or species among the inhabitants of the world. Now, of course, he's going to have to say something about how we go from the particular acquaintances, the many that we have, to the more general conception, which forms an enduring part of our thinking about the world. But he at least is not faced with the almost impossible task of having a conception of divinity and the aspect of human beings which is divine, on the basis that that aspect is something completely different from what can be gleaned by what we learn about human beings through our everyday experience. And so, if we look back to the detail I pulled out of Raphael's study of the Academy, we see Aristotle. Now, if I was to show you the whole picture, the Academy, beside him you would see Plato, pointing heavenwards for the source of our intellectual life. And in that context, seeing Aristotle holding out his hand in this way takes on a whole new dimension. Don't look at somewhere inscrutable and inaccessible. Look around you. And let's figure out how we can go from looking around us and deepening our acquaintance here and now with imminent things to getting to something that has quite a different kind of nature in our thinking and status for the correctness or otherwise of our thought. Because of course with God you kind of get it for free. God is always right. Even when God, or the gods, are full of human frailties and weaknesses, as Hercules pointed out to the Greeks. So, in the tragedy Heracles, Hercules said, "You can't expect me to believe in gods who have all the spitefulness and emotional disturbance and frailty of human creatures. If there is a God, that God is not going to be like that." Now this from a pagan source, the tragedian Euripides, is of course a very profound insight, pointing to the fact that it is very natural for human beings to model the gods on their own acquaintance with persons, which is necessarily of mortal beings, human beings like themselves. And what should be carried over from the one idea, an adequate understanding of human beings, to the other idea, that being, whoever he or she is, who created everything, including human beings, is not at all clear. The mind could go in many directions. At least to Hercules it wasn't clear. But one thing was clear, that if the gods had all the frailties and pettiness and jealousy that he had suffered at the hands of Hera, the queen of the gods, because he happened to be an illegitimate child of Zeus, the king of the gods, and her partner, then that wasn't the kinds of God he could be expected to respect and worship. So Aristotle confronts this problem. Our knowledge of the gods is and must be remote from us. Nevertheless, we reason about, we make pronouncements about, and we make determinations about, which we rationally articulate and then argue about, all kinds of things which form the basis of metaphysical species, human beings, lions, tigers, giraffes, gold, all kinds of stuff. So let's not just help ourselves to the idea that our intellectual grasp of these things is somehow remote and can only be approached by mystical contemplation. Let's see how far we can go with the idea that we do start on exactly the same basis as all other creatures: embodiment, sensibility, movement, with something else going on, which for the moment we'll call intellect. And then fairly soon, in his writing, he says, but let's make a distinction between cleverness, which all creatures have to show in order just to survive, and we share with them all, and true understanding, which takes us somehow beyond that. Actually, he was talking about practical wisdom at the time, how we should conduct ourselves in the light of what is really true of the world. So that's what he considered practical wisdom to be. And from the outset, he distinguished that merely from the survival tricks we need to get by. There is this kind of contemplative or inclusive or all-encompassing aspect to wisdom that mere cleverness or Machiavellian ability to respond to situations as they arise did not include, but which it was often confused with. He also developed some other ideas based on the idea that we were creatures like a lot of other creatures. He realized that all creatures move from a point of potentiality to a point of actuality. So if you look at the seed of any creature and you look at its beginnings, what is going to be true of that creature is at that stage unformed, and it becomes formed. So what is it that actually emerges as the form of the creature through this process of moving from potentiality to actuality? Is the form actually given ahead of time, or does it in a sense arise out of that organic process? Because if all the actualities of a creature arise out of the organic process, then the intellect is not going to be different, insofar as it is an aspect of us as animate creatures. It too is going to arise. So we need to look to the sources or process of its formation so that it takes the form it does, which we won't dispute with Plato is an intellectual form, which deals in a sense with ideal descriptions of things, or specifications, or prescriptions, or whatever. But let's not just help ourselves to them and say that they're kind of magically there from the beginning. Let's try and understand this process of arising or emergence. Now, of course, as soon as we begin to think about that from the perspective of the 20th century, we realise that the intellectual form which we grow into or develop is in some really important way tied up with our neurological form, the formation of our nervous system. It remains a question as to whether we will find the ingredients within the nervous system itself to allow for that actualization, because if we were to look at the essence of the nervous system, or a guiding conception which will reveal to us what its true form is rather than just what it's made up of, its matter, we realise that the nervous system is a way of putting us in touch with what is around us. So it seems, just on the basis of that, that the idea that the actuality which the nervous system comes to realise is going to be totally given by what's going on within the nervous system, that just looks ab initio implausible. Because its whole job is to put us in touch with something wider. That's what it's there for. Well, if that's its true or conceptual form, then it's far more than a self-contained biological event or process or organ. It's in fact got an openness and an openness to being brought to its actuality in a way that we will need to look carefully at. Now, in fact, we've learnt a lot since Aristotle, but he did realise something. He did realise that left to itself, an organism gets all fired up. It gets moved or impelled or pushed in various directions. And sometimes it gets fired up in a way that is likely to bring it to harm through its own actions or through its tendency to bump into things which it shouldn't bump into. Like hungry lions, for instance, that wouldn't be the greatest idea. And so the nervous system, in a sense, exists to cool it down from jumping off in this direction or the other, just to let off energy, and tends to guide and shape what it's doing by taking into account what is going on around it. So he talks about the life of an intellectual creature, of an intelligent creature, as drawing on things we could think of as kind of a little bit distinct. A kind of principle of energy or action, and a principle which is saying all the time, not so fast. Just hold it a moment. Suss this situation out. Cool down. See where you're going. Think what's likely to happen. And therefore he's sometimes written about as arguing that the basis of the human soul is the heart, which of course gets us going and also traditionally is the side of emotion, or getting us all fired up, and that he discounted the role of the brain. Not at all. He just noted something which it's taken us a couple of millennia to catch up with, that the main role of the higher centres of the brain is to cool down the impulsive activity of the lower centres of the brain. And the more the higher centres of the brain do their work of putting us in touch with a wide range of contingencies which would perhaps make you inclined to think again, as in the Scottish national anthem, the more we become creatures who are highly flexible in the face of all kinds of different, dangerous and partially unknown environments, where an impulsive mode of relating to the world is likely to lead to a bad outcome. And he expresses this in various ways. He says, for instance, the blood of passion that springs through the human body is cooled down by the brain. And then he thinks of a mnemonic for remembering that. Well, actually the surface of the brain is quite near the surface of the body. So you could think of it as the place where the heat is kind of cooled down a bit. And some later commentators, slightly more flat-footed, have said Aristotle only believes that the brain is there to cool the blood. Well, if those same flat-footed commentators help themselves to even a soupçon of metaphor, they'd perhaps realise they were saying something quite profound. So Aristotle, in his work De Anima, makes a number of remarks about the human soul, that which animates us, that which could be seen as the living form that we instantiate as human beings. He notices that we take a lot of cognizance of our objects, that if you grow up in the jungle, your soul is likely to be slightly different from what it will be if you grow up in the urban jungle. There's certain commonality, but there's going to be differences. He makes other comments which suggest that our soul has got something to do with our whole mode of life and what we need to take on board in order to live successfully. This remark, the soul is to the body as sight is to the eye. And this, of course, could be taken as a bit of a poke at anatomists, knowing that there are some present. We all know that it would be very silly if a very enthusiastic but somewhat unreflective anatomist were to carefully dissect the eye in search of sight. He or she, let's call it he, wouldn't find it. You won't find sight in the eye. You will actually find a mechanism, a purely physical mechanism, that in the context of the functioning of a whole organism serves the sole purpose, not S-O-L-E purpose, but S-O-U-L purpose, of giving that organism teloception. Getting a sense of what's coming up. And for that reason, and because cognition is anticipation, as some 20th century psychologists were at pains to point out, sight is really important to us. It tells us what lies out there beyond the range of touch. But what if you've got reasonably good information trackers that tell you about tendencies going on in the things you see, is going to come into touchable range about now or in the near future. And that is, of course, tremendously useful. You don't have to snuffle along the ground until you bump into something before you're aware that it's there. You can be looking ahead, you can see that the lions are gathering, and you can think, well, perhaps I just better not go there, before you suddenly find yourself in the middle of a prowling ring of hungry lions. So Aristotle, having understood that there's this way of reaching out to and getting information about objects, which is something that humans seem to do in a much more all-encompassing way than a lot of other creatures, then wrestles with the fact that his teacher would have constantly reminded of all, that the intellect grasps things which are not just evanescent, but which are in some sense enduring. They may be enduring and they may also be invisible. The essence of gold, for instance, is in the atomic, is in the subnuclear structure of the gold atom. And that's invisible. You only discover it by a kind of guided, clever probing after a kind of truth which is not visible. What's visible is this yellow, malleable stuff that seems relatively enduring and glitters in the light, and that doesn't get dissolved by certain acids and so on and so forth. What's invisible is what makes it so. That you can only find out by engaging in a certain kind of inquiry, which doesn't, as it were, come naturally. Chimpanzees, however clever they are, don't build laboratories. They may do clever things in laboratories that we build, and we may be able to observe them, but they don't build them. In fact, Aristotle is prepared to give quite a bit to animals. He says, yeah, they've got imagination, all right. Who could doubt it when you see a dog barking up the wrong tree? It imagines what it's barking at is up that tree, but of course it isn't. It's up a different tree. What they don't have, according to Aristotle, is the ability to inquire after truth and falsity, to refine ideas, to argue about them, to debate whether the way things strike them is the way they actually are, which his master Plato was, of course, an adept at, and expressed it through the mouth of Socrates. So any of you who've read Socratic dialogues realise that there's this wonderful probing inquiry about what we actually mean when we use a certain term. What aspect of the appearances before us are we actually drawing attention to? For human beings, for instance, what strikes us is a physical body of a certain shape. what is not perceptible, at least to the untutored eye or to the unthinking eye, is the human intellect, human intelligence. That is gleaned or discerned or abstracted from an extended observation in which you notice that certain patterns are showing up in what human beings do that can only be accounted for if you credit them with certain kinds of knowledge of the things around them. And some of that knowledge relates to non-evident features of the things around them, such as the true essence of God. But fortunately we don't have to discover these things all by ourselves, as Aristotle had clearly witnessed. He had seen his teacher teach others, argue with them, instruct them, draw their attention to certain features of what appeared to them, critique the way in which they expressed what they'd discerned, so that the elements of what they'd discerned, which were not true understandings of the things that they had come in contact with, would be pared away and their understanding would be improved. And so we come to the bottom point on this slide. He himself had been there, as he had seen human cognition, human thought formed in discourse by Socrates, by Plato, the Academy. He realized quite clearly that we are discursive creatures. He realized something that anthropologists have recently raised for our attention yet again through the Max Planck Institute in Germany. The Michael Tomasello, who works there, has described the way human beings construct what he calls an objective, reflective, normative domain. A domain which takes intellectual hold of the objects that we encounter, encourages us to reflect on them through conversation, exchange, argument, and comes to ideas which can then usefully be passed on, so that our cognitive apprentices can come to more adequate conceptions of those things they are dealing with. And those of us in university life, well, that's what the government pays us to do. Sometimes it doesn't exactly like the results of inquiry and reflection, but it likes us to go far enough to feel they're doing something worthwhile. So that through this process of discourse, reasoning, contestation, argument, refinement of thought, we come to a reasonable view of the world. A view of the world which is worth holding on to, which can be defended against certain objections, and which can be clearly expressed in the words we choose to use. The last is sometimes obscured in certain academic disciplines where we construct whole edifices of words that up until that time nobody's ever heard of, and insist that everybody else use them. But some of us don't actually go along with that too much. So we could think of ourselves as triply responsive creatures who form our neurocognitive assemblies, if we want to refer to what's going on in the brain that way, through our triple responsiveness, our responsiveness to ourselves, to our experience, what we've encountered, to the world as we encounter it, and to the corrections and arguments and contestations of others that we engage in and take notice of and refine or reject some of our ideas. That's why it's so important for us to learn to represent and communicate the states of affairs we become part of in terms that are open to everybody else to think about and argue about. And this then becomes a very important part of human consciousness. Consciousness becomes our ability to actively make use of these rich sources of information which we indwell. We see, we smell, we touch, we hear. Not only that, we learn from others, we argue with them. We then examine our ideas and change them where they need changing because something shows up that causes us to wonder what's going on. And so, in that way, our interface with the world, our sensory motor coupling with the world, where we pick up information from it and do things to it, becomes caught up in a much bigger kind of thing. And this bigger kind of thing is the multiple ways in which what John Locke called signification play on us, bring out links, associations, connections between things. And these get laid one upon another, line upon line, precept upon precept, one might say. And gradually we become formed as what Heidegger called creatures of the word, creatures in whom words have made us a certain way, fit for human commerce, well, in the broader sense, not the neoliberal sense. And in fact brings us into a world which through human communication can be present to us, even though in another sense we're not sensory motor coupled with it at all. So I may go home tonight and I might be lucky enough to have an email from my son or one of my daughters. Now, I have no sensory motor coupling with them at the moment. They're not here. They're in the Northern Hemisphere. And part of the email will probably concern whether I have any plans to go there and actually get face-to-face with them, connect up with them again, see what's passing across their faces, see what's passing across the faces of their children, look for recognition there, and aim to make an impression. And that will all come about because of this notional world, this imaginary world, which we share and communicate about, which for me is not present. Air New Zealand is not in this room. Heathrow Airport is even further away. But those will all be part of what happens if, in fact, the encounter which I look forward to brings itself about. Okay, so this just introduces a whole other aspect. I think I could probably profitably leave things there, and we could pick up any other points in conversation, but this guy is called Emmanuel Levinas. He is a Jewish thinker who lost a Lithuanian Jew who lost his family in the Holocaust. That caused him to think very deeply about the ways in which we engage with each other as human beings, and what it is that's absolutely essential to our recognizing each other as human beings and engaging with each other in a way that could potentially become wholehearted. And out of that emerges a whole other idea. A whole idea about the precious things we all share. Now, we know that Gollum had my precious, which he didn't want to share with anybody, because it enabled him to distance himself at will from encounters with other human beings. And that was a selfish power that he clung to. But for most of us, the world of engagement, the world of meeting and partly indwelling the stories of others, is a world we enjoy sharing, and that makes us better, as Jack Nicholson's character says in As Good as It Gets to Helen Hunt's character. You make me want to be a better person. I struck this headline on Big Think, which is a website. Harvard researchers have found the source of human consciousness. Well, in the same sense that one might say ophthalmologists have found the source of human sight. Eyes don't reveal much unless they're rightly connected in human beings. Brains don't reveal much, except under the same conditions. Because our real concern is whole, inspiring, in the sense of breathing, and inspirited, in the sense of full of life, human beings, persons, open to each other, conscious of each other, prepared to engage with each other, prepared to share an imaginary world, which includes things like Heathrow Airport, when you're in New Zealand, that allow even greater engagement with one another, and so on, and so forth. And so, as another imaginary human being famously said, that's all I've got to say about that.
We probably have a few minutes just for a few questions, so would anybody like to respond to what Grant has offered to us?
For those of you who like historical theologians, you've just heard a Thomist lecture. Thomas Aquinas faithfully and articulately unpacked Aristotle's philosophy in terms of its significance for orthodox Christian belief as he understood it.
Did you get all this by divine revelation, or what? Was it intellectual prowess?
You contrast the two. Not something that the angelic doctor would do. The angelic doctor, of course, regarded one of the principal roots for divine revelation to be human reason. Human reason rightly grounded, and not losing sight of the appearances and what it is right to think about the way the world comes to us. Regarded that as the source of inspiration, along with the possibility of direct communication, which a natural philosophy couldn't possibly help itself to. And that thought he shared with Immanuel Kant. As far as human reason is concerned, unaided reason could never arrive at orthodox belief. That, and of course that he shared with Karl Barth.
Saying neuroscience cannot quantitate the soul.
It can tell us a lot about the means by which we are creatures who can be ensouled. But if one were to accept a view such as that of Emmanuel Levinas, then being ensouled is something about being connected in a certain kind of way to all other human beings, which has a lot to do with language, but also a lot to do with relationships of hospitality and appreciation and respect and recognition of witness and a whole lot of things.
God consciousness.
Yeah, God consciousness is kind of interesting.
Another lecture.
Yeah, it's probably limbic. It just looks that the temporal lobe and the deep self-related and emotive circuits in the brain are the circuits most active when one is as you might kind of just expect by properly describing the topic, when we're thinking about our own being and place in the order of things. That's in some broader sense than geographical location. We know that geographical location's got a lot to do with what's going on, or knowing your geographical location's got a lot to do with what's going on in the hippocampus. But those other things about who I really am in the total order of things take us a little bit beyond that.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I just have I think I don't quite understand your definition of consciousness again. Maybe I misunderstood. Doesn't your definition say that a person who is not open to discussion and kind of asocial would not be conscious?
My definition of consciousness is a rich openness to encounter with the world and what is in it.
But not everybody has this openness.
That's true. There are close-minded people around. Some of us have even met them.
Because so in your definition they are not conscious.
Of course they're conscious. I mean, in a sense, in one sense, you know, a monkey is conscious, in fact in quite a rich sense, but yet Søren Kierkegaard said, if a monkey looks in a mirror, he will not see there the face of an apostle. Of course he's absolutely conscious, and even if St. Paul was standing at his shoulder, the monkey wouldn't see the face of the apostle, except in the barest sense.
At one point when you were talking about the soul, in terms of cognition
The soul is a somewhat richer term. It is supposed to encompass our emotional life, our memory, the effects of what has happened to us in our past, even if it's not, those things are not explicitly remembered. So the soul, as used by Aristotle and Aristotelians, includes things that wouldn't traditionally come into particularly a post-Cartesian understanding of the mind as purely intellectual or cognitive. So I myself use a term which is kind of an ugly term, responsivity. So there's something that goes down between two human beings, which is very difficult to intellectualize. It's a kind of soul thing. You know, it's kind of like the guy who says, look, tell me, what really is good jazz? And he meets the answer, you know, well, if you got to ask, I ain't never going to be able to tell you. So the soul is a more inclusive term. It was for Aristotle all the richness of life that any given creature happens to instantiate. So you could say, for instance, that a plant of grass has a soul, not a blade of grass because it's only part of it, but the living grass plant has a soul. It's just quite boring, as a matter of fact. I mean, perhaps the most profound thought that can occur to a grass plant is, here comes the sun. But then the Beatles knew all about that.
Right, critics of the trajectory of thought you have described, among whom are Kierkegaard and Martin Luther, who we're remembering this year especially, would say that this trajectory of thought doesn't prepare us very well to recognise the God who shows up in Jesus. How do you respond to that?
Well, Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor, comes out with one of the most orthodox remarks about life after death that has ever been written. He basically says that the only thing that assures anybody of life after death is their being in God. Aristotle, of course, is a pagan and naturalist writer. The highest point that the human soul can reach for Aristotle is the point at which we become able to reason, which he locates in argument, learning, conceptualization, and politics, understood somewhat more richly than might be these days. But there's an aspect of his development of the understanding of the human soul that is kind of open. So if God is part of creation and communicating with human beings in certain ways, then for an Aristotelian such as Thomas, those communications will be indicating something beyond nature as we understand it. And if we're not deaf to them, they will direct our thought in certain ways that will lead us to a consonance with revelation. The way that Kant, of course, followed very much this line of thought and didn't think that unaided human reason could ever reach at a conception of God, an adequate conception of God. But then he said, human reason in and of itself can't understand revelation either. This goes beyond the categories that it is prepared to understand through earthly experience. But of course he was a pietist, which in his day was kind of a charismatic.
Thanks, Grant. A couple of questions I think are linked. It seems to me that you've got two definitions of sort of the soul of consciousness. One for multiple, but one of them was about the power we have for imagination. And the other one was towards the end, Levinasian turn towards embodiment and the idea of connectedness with other human beings. I wonder if you can unpack how, going back to Nicola's question at the beginning, how is that distinctness or uniqueness amongst us as a species as opposed to other creatures, particularly the imagination and connectedness? Like, to what extent is that Levinasian turn towards a connectedness that pulls us beyond merely connectedness with other human species, but also to life itself?
Yeah. I think to answer that question properly, you do have to go to the angelic doctor's answer about immortality. That the only assurance of immortality is being in God. So that if you are not a creature whose being is in God, and that's where your affinity is, willingly is, then from a natural point of view, from the point of view of your natural life as a human being, you cannot expect immortality. Immortality is solely of grace, it is not of nature. Now, as soon as you allow that to colour your thought, you realise that, yes, there's a distinct kind of connectivity, which a kind of relational human connectivity involving things like fidelity and promise keeping and all kinds of stuff that isn't open in the same way to animals, because we always have the choice of detaching ourselves from those commitments, whereas animals just, it's the scorpion going across the river again. You do what a scorpion does. You don't have any choice, really. So, human uniqueness, it seems to me, is the ability to participate intelligently and open-endedly in a distinctly human world, to which animals only have a very partial entree. Dogs perhaps get closer than most. Cats are a little bit disdainful or self-consciously separate from that in a thin sense of self-consciousness. But animals in general can't see the apostle in the mirror, even if he's standing at their shoulder, because they're not part of that whole symbolic world which we've so created that it transforms the meaning of almost every event in our lives. And so that's what I think humans uniqueness consists in. Our ability to actually move in and participate in that deeply symbolic and significant world, which connects us in a certain way with all other human beings, potentially. And of course, some people like building walls to stop some of those connections. Some people even believe it's worth actually doing. No accounting for some people.
Well, on that note, perhaps we'll draw things to a close. Thank you very much for your attendance tonight, and please do take one of these, which provides more information about NZCIS and opportunity to become part of the organisation. But before we close, let me thank Grant very sincerely for, yet again, as he always does, making complex matters simple enough for the rest of us to understand, but not simpler than they really are. Thank you,
I read them all to my children.
Yeah.